Well, thank you all for coming today. It's so nice to see you all back in the room for the seminar series. And to quite a privilege to have Nicky Falkof with us today. So I'll start off with a few thank yous, giving you a sense of how the session will work, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So first, I want to thank my co-conveners of the seminar series on the histories of capitalism and race, through which this talk has been organized. And today with us is Hengame Ziadi in the back, but also traveling, unfortunately, today are Samia Khatoon, also in HRP, and Lisa Tilley in Development Studies. And our gang has been putting this together. And then I really want to thank Hanvi Kanchan, who is just incredible, and without him, this would all fall apart. So thank you so much, Tanvi. So the way that we run our seminars usually is that we have about 20 minutes from the speaker, from the author of the book, Nicky. And then we have respondent comments. We're very lucky to have Sharri Plonski with us for that today. And then I'll give Nicky a few minutes to respond to Sharri. And then we'll open it up to all of you. So our session today is about around an hour and 20 minutes. So that should give us maybe 40 minutes or so. We like to not call it Q&A and think of it more of a discussion and a conversation. So we'll actually kind of hold back on Nicky's responses and get a number questions and comments, and people are welcome to speak to Nicky, but also to each other during that conversation. And then we'll hand it over to Nicky for a few responses. And depending on time, we'll try to do another round of that. Oh, and I'm Sarah Kozis. I'm in the politics department, so I always forget to do that part. Like, is this weird talking at us? Okay. So I'll introduce Nicky and get us started. So Nicky Falkof is a writer and academic based in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she holds the Sarchi Chair in Critical Diversity Studies and heads up the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. Her research is primarily concerned with race and anxiety in South Africa, with a specific interest in the forms, mythologies, and consequences of white fear. She has secondary interests in gender, popular media and culture, moral panic, and the social geography of global South cities, particularly Joburg. She has written on topics as diverse as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, luxury beauty spots, Satanist murders, and Joburg's notorious Parktown prawns. So there's a lot to read because Nicky is incredibly prolific, and her publications include 5 monographs, including Worrier State, which we're talking about today, and even newer book she's discussing this evening is at Westminster, called The Devil Made Me Do It, Understanding Occult Crime in South Africa. And she's the author of 3 other edited volumes and numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals that I won't get into. But also publishes in other venues, including, which is really cool for us today, a podcast episode on murder in Melville, which I believe features in the book.
Yeah, the neighborhood does.
In the second season of the Material Crimes podcast, which is co-hosted by Sharri Plonski and a SOAS alum, actually, Maya Holterman and Twistle. And so I think this is the first time you guys are actually meeting in person, even though they've had this amazing collaboration. It's so nice to have that happen here through the seminar series. And Nicky, back to Nicky, who has a PhD in Interdisciplinary Humanities and Cultural Studies from the London Consortium, right here from Birkbeck College, and a master's in Critical Theory from Sussex University. I'm going to hand it over to Nicky and then introduce Sharri when it's time for you to speak. Okay, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was going to mention material crimes, so I'm glad that you already have. It's really nice to be at SOAS. As you said, I did my PhD at Birkbeck, and I used to hang around here quite a lot in the bar that no longer exists. But also I launched my first book at SOAS, God, it feels like a really long time ago, about 10 years ago. So it's a really, really nice invitation for me. I'm going to start with an apology and some plugs. The apology is I've actually flew in last night. So I arrived this morning and I'm a bit sick. So I'm a little bit like, my head is full of cotton wool, but I'll do my best. And then 2 plugs. Firstly, the book that Sarah mentioned. I actually have some copies. If anybody wants to buy a copy from me, come chat to me afterwards, because it means I have to less stuff to carry around for the rest of the day. And then secondly, just to say that the book we're talking about today, Worrier State, is part of a series that I co-edit with my colleague Sri Leroy, and it's based at Manchester UP. It's called Governing Intimacies in the Global South. And we're very, very interested in books about race, gender, sexuality, intersecting with power in the Global South. We've had a lot of work on South Africa and India, because that's where the two of us come from. But if anyone has a book proposal that at some stage that is relevant to this, that you think you might want to pitch, you are welcome to email me and I'll send you some information. Okay, so let me talk about this book. My life changed radically at the beginning of this year when I got a new job. I'm just going to time myself so I don't go on for too long. And I took over a research chair from a colleague who was retiring and started running a research center, the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. And what that has meant, having a research chair and running a research center, is that I do zero research. So this invitation was actually really amazing for me, because it's forced me to go back and think about a book that was completed what feels like a very, very long time ago. In the interim, I've written another book, I've had kids, I've changed jobs, and I had to go back and look at Worrier State, which was a project I was very emotionally tied to, and see whether it felt like it's still held up. And in many ways, I'm relieved to feel that it does. Obviously, this happens with everyone when you go back to your old writing, right? There are things in it that make me cringe enormously. I think that happens to all of us. But there's a lot in it that I think is relevant, despite the fact that the world has changed in really significant ways since 2020. Or 2023 is when it was published, I think. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to briefly run through what I think of as some of the major theoretical arguments or innovations of the book. And I'm then going to talk about the 3 chapters that you weren't asked to read, which were in effect about white supremacy, about gender-based violence, and about the racial politics of space. The chapter that I did ask you to read, I shared because I think it's maybe the most original thing in the book. I don't think people are talking about consumption in the Global South in this way. There's obviously a lot of very interesting work about consumption in the Global South and what consumption means from a socio-political perspective in South Africa. But what I was trying to look at is the kind of magical thinking that surrounds how people consume and how people feel about what they consume. So I'm really interested to hear people's takes on this kind of strange plasma gang urban legend. The intro or preface to the book that I sent around as well, that we sent around, makes it clear that this is a very personal project. It's also necessary, I think, to state my location. You know, I was trained in interdisciplinary humanities and cultural studies at the London Consortium, which was an amazing experiment that no longer exists. And then I got a job in media studies, and now I work in diversity studies, which my predecessor made up. So I don't have a disciplinary location, which would be an absolute nightmare if I worked here and had to deal with the ref. This is one of the small privileges that you get from being an academic in certain locations in the Global South, is that it's very, very easy to jump disciplinary boundaries in a way that elsewhere might require a little bit more justification. Another one of the benefits of working in the Global South is that we can talk about Palestine without worrying that we're going to lose our jobs. But that's another conversation. Okay, so some of the major points that I want to emphasize from the theoretical chapter. There are 4 things, going back to it and looking back on it, there are 4 things that I think are important to think about. Firstly, why anxiety? What's this thing with anxiety? Now, when I started writing this book, I thought it was going to be a project about moral panic. I was talking to a friend and I was like, oh, you know, difficult second album, what do I do? She's like, oh, you're into moral panic, write about that. So I went and looked at all the moral panic theory and ended up taking all of that work and shoving it in a journal article where I attempted to re-theorize moral panic. It's the most boring thing I've ever done with the most citations I've ever had. The idea of moral panic, as I say in the book, I think still has a lot of value. I think the term itself is so engaging and dramatic that there's a lot that we can do with it. But I wasn't interested in going, how does moral panic happen in South Africa? And I wasn't interested in going, how do we talk about risk theory in South Africa? I wanted to use the ideas of risk and moral panic because they already exist and are useful. But for me, the real nub was anxiety. So I've done a lot of projects around anxiety. Before Worrier State, my previous big project was a co-edited book with a colleague from WITS called Anxious Joburg, in which we basically say that one of the easiest ways to understand a complicated, unequal, demanding, and dangerous city like Johannesburg is to think about the level of anxiety that it creates for different people in different ways. And since then, I've written about my own experience of being a white mother in a dangerous city and what that kind of mothering anxiety feels like in this particular location. So I find anxiety to be incredibly productive and useful, possibly more useful than fear. And this is because the idea of anxiety allows us to think about affect. It allows us to think about rather an affect, a feeling, a sense of being in the world that's free floating, that's unfocused, that has a fluid or even absent object. So you can feel anxious without there actually being anything for you to be anxious about, right? It's a miasma that people live within. And this is as relevant here as it is in Joburg. You know, let's be clear from the start that Johannesburg is not some sort of crazy outlier. That this, and Zygmunt Bauman, who I cite a lot, makes this very, very clear that, you know, anxiety and fear are conditions of late capitalism. It's not necessarily to do with how much crime you face. But I find the idea of anxiety very useful in helping me understand the particular experience of moving through and trying to survive and trying to live a good life in a place like Johannesburg. Secondly, there is the very important point that in South Africa, fear is not a consequence of living in a safer city. So when I started doing this project, you know, most of the theory that I was reading, most of the stuff that I was reading about so-called cultures of fear was saying, yes, we've all gotten safer. And as we've gotten safer, we've gotten more worried. And that's what's going on. You know, people in Britain, people in the US, people in Europe face less empirical risk, but are more anxious. What does that mean? And it was really interesting for me to think about the fact that that doesn't work when you translate it to South Africa, because you are talking about higher empirical rates of risk, right? Sometimes I've given this talk before, or talks related to this, where I like to put up a slide that shows our crime stats. I did this most recently in Switzerland and got the very satisfying experience of the entire audience going, because it is a very dangerous place in many ways. But one thing that popped up for me repeatedly in doing this work is that the fact of empirical risk doesn't actually change the way that fear works as a social phenomenon all that much. In some ways it does, but in other ways it doesn't. So risk in a place like Joburg is still real. It's real and much higher than it is here, but it's also in the same way that it is in the global north, still overdetermined. So one example that I can give of what I mean by this is that, you know, I talk in the preface about how when I moved back to Joburg, people were giving me all of these theories about how to be safe and what's dangerous and what to be careful of, yada, yada, yada. One of the stories that came up and that still comes up is you've got to be very careful about, for example, a Coca-Cola can that's left on the verge outside your house, or a certain kind of chalk marking, because what that means is that you've been targeted by criminal gangs who are going to break into your house, possibly hurt you, and definitely steal all your stuff. Now, if a story like that popped up in a place like Brighton, where I used to live, you'd go, oh, how weird, ha ha ha, that's hilarious. It's just a weird urban legend. But in Joburg, the chances of your house being targeted by a criminal gang are not small. So the risk is real. But the excessive, overblown, overdetermined story that accrues to the risk is not. So people are doing the same sorts of things. They're using the same kinds of narratives, but there's this disjuncture between what we should be afraid of and what is actually frightening, which I think is really significant in South Africa. Just as an aside, this theoretical notion that, you know, we become more anxious as we become safer, I don't know if that still holds in 2025. I mean, my sense is that in this age of fascism, populism, and climate change, that fear is being edged out as a social force by rage. But of course, that rage is driven by fear. So, you know, there is a way in which those ideas do need to be interrogated, regardless of the context that you're talking about. Third, what I think is very important is the idea of misrecognition. And it was surprising to me that a lot of the theory of moral panic and conspiracy theory doesn't pay much attention to misrecognition. It's more about going, oh, people made things up. They just made it up out of nowhere. They panicked out of nothing. Whereas when you look at these stories on a kind of quite granular level, a lot of the time what you realize is there is actually something frightening there or something potentially dangerous. People are just misrecognizing it and turning it into something else. So I guess the paradigmatic example of this is from that terrible book. Has anyone read this, Freakonomics? So it's been multiply discredited. They have a whole lot of stuff in Freakonomics. They make a really good point where they say, you know, children in the US are more likely to die by falling in a swimming pool than by being shot by a gun. And yet we're more afraid of guns than swimming pools. So we're misrecognizing the cause of threat. Now, of course, this was an incredibly cynical thing for them to do, because what they were basically going is saying, you know, gun panics are overblown. You can be afraid of swimming pools and be afraid of guns at the same time. But this is the instance of the kind of example of misrecognition that gets used a lot when people write about how we misunderstand where threat really comes from. In South Africa, you know, part of what I try and argue is that people worry about the right threats, but attribute them to the wrong causes. So if we go back to our Coca-Cola can, for example, you know, if your house gets robbed, maybe your panic is that your house got robbed because you missed the sign. There was a sign or a symbol somewhere that showed that you had been targeted by a violent criminal gang. And if you'd seen that and be able to get rid of it, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. That's not true. But your house was still robbed, right? You were still a victim of a violent, potentially violent and frightening crime. So there's something going on there where instead of going, okay, you know, we live in a country with too many guns and very weak legislation and massive, overwhelming poverty, huge corruption, poor policing, all of those things contribute to violent crime. And that's why my house got robbed. Instead, you're going to go, I was targeted by a gang and I didn't see the signs. So you're misrecognizing why this happened, even though you're understanding what it is. And then finally, I just want to highlight the importance of discourse and narrative. And again, this was something that was quite surprising in really digging into literature on moral panic, is that I think it's because it comes very much from this hardcore social science background. People don't want to talk about stories. You know, they want to talk about their methodology, and they want to put, you know, they want to talk about their research questions, and they want to have a lot of headings, but they don't really want to talk about the fluid and effective nature of story, and that this is how it works. So I think it's very, very important when looking at this stuff to understand what is the story, what is the language that's being used, what emotional or mythological quality is being appealed to in this understanding of crime and violence. This is why I've got a clock, because I thought that was going to take me 5 minutes. Okay, let me briefly talk you through the other 3 chapters. So the first chapter is about white genocide, which I'm sure you're all much more familiar with now than you would have been last year, given the explosion of global paranoia around white genocide in South Africa at the start of this year. I'm sure many of you heard about the Afrikaner refugee program, that all of these white Afrikaners are getting shipped off to Trump's America because they're refugees. You know, these people are not refugees. These people are wealthy. They're retaining their South African passports. They're getting put on chartered flights. A lot of them are taking their dogs. You know, this is not how refugee status usually works. So back in 2018, there was an explosion of anxiety around the so-called white genocide. The idea of the white genocide does not originate from South Africa. It actually comes from the US far right, and it's been imported to us. We have other ideas. You know, we have our own ideas about reverse apartheid and reverse racism. White genocide spread through the internet and arrived in South Africa and was taken up enthusiastically by bodies like the Red October campaign, which was run by an Afrikaner musician called Steve Hofmeyer, and AfriForum, which is a self-described minority rights group, which very skillfully adopts and misuses the idea of the minority to say that because there are fewer white Afrikaners in South Africa than there are Black South Africans, white Afrikaners are a minority. So being a numerical minority automatically makes you an object of threat, and you therefore need all sorts of special measures to protect you. So what happened was there was this kind of explosion of concern around the so-called white genocide, where white people were being murdered in their beds by black people, and it was all targeted. There were loads of really bizarre stories that popped up. There were stories about how these were government death squads. There were also stories about how the people perpetrating these killings were coming over the border from Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and there were gangs of foreigners who were coming to slaughter whites. There were stories about torture. There were stories about mass rape. Now, there are a lot of deaths of white people in South Africa, and a lot of these are incredibly violent, but there are also a lot of deaths of other people in South Africa, and they are also often incredibly violent. So what I tried to do here was to use a close analysis of publicly available media texts to show how these two different groups spoke about white genocide, and how the idea of white genocide was used to foster the notion that white people were extraordinary victims of violence in South Africa. There are two main points that I want to raise here. Firstly, claims of genocide were often used to pass much more everyday fears. So where white people, white Afrikaners, were panicking that Afrikaans was no longer a central language to South Africa, or that names of towns were getting changed and that they felt that their culture was being pushed to the side, that was narrativized as genocidal. Things like infrastructure collapse, bad hospitals, dirty parks, dirty rivers, this was narrativized as genocidal, even though it affects everyone in South Africa. So there was this kind of explosion of how anything that made white people feel uncomfortable could be classified as an element of the genocide. And secondly, there was a very cynical and quite shameless weaponization of actual murders of white people, where murders of white people, particularly on farms, were recast as instances of a planned, specific and undertaken genocide. And these people were then, regardless of what their own histories were then pulled into this burgeoning global movement that led to the stuff that happened at the beginning of this year, where Afrikaners could go and claim refugee status in the US. And this was all done in the service of a specific political agenda that was about countering the Expropriation Act, which I don't really have time to get into today, but there was a huge panic around this act that the African National Congress was bringing in that was about expropriating unused land. And bodies like AfriForum decided that what this meant is that the communists had finally arrived and they were going to come and take your farm and your house and probably your dog and your cows and your wife. And you were going to be left destitute because this is what they had always wanted to do, ignoring the fact that the post-1994 ANC is just like a neoliberal nightmare. So what happened there was that the loss of land was equated to mass death for Afrikaners. So in the white genocide conspiracy theory, threats, social and political threats to the primacy of whiteness and white people's increased vulnerability to the violence that has always affected other South Africans was seen to be exemplars of a genocide. Ooh, I'm really running out of time. Okay, I'll try and whiz through these. The next chapter was about so-called Satanist murders. There was a huge satanic panic in South Africa in the 80s, which I've written about at length. In the particular instances that I'm talking about, the first was in 2011, a young woman called Kirsty Theologo was lured up to a hillside by some friends, had gasoline poured all over her and was set alight and left to die. In the second episode in 2014, two girls named Tandeka Moganetsi and Chwayita Ratazayo were stabbed to death and their bodies were mutilated, left in an open field in Dobsonville in Soweto. And these are only two of the examples. In my new book, I have another one. I have a list of like so many young women that this happened to. And in these instances, because South Africans are primed to see satanic conspiracies everywhere, what happens is that instead of going, this is part of our national problem of violence, or more specifically, this is part of our national problem of gender-based violence, the press and the police collectively go, this is a satanic murder. Because maybe the killers left a pentagram on the ground, or maybe when they were in the trial, they said, yes, an evil spirit took over me. And the question that I wanted to ask, and the point that I wanted to make here is, an act of gender-based violence, an act of homicidal gender-based violence that's inspired by Satanism, how different is that to an act of homicidal gender-based violence that's inspired by lust, or greed, or jealousy, or anger, or a sense of impotence, or any of the other things that lead people to this kind of violent act? But because we have this long history of panicking about Satanism, we have the capacity to exceptionalize these particular murders and go, well, we don't need to think about that anymore because we already understand what it means. And then finally, the last chapter in the book was about a Facebook group called I Love Melville, which is the neighborhood that I live in. It's the neighborhood that I did my podcast episode for Sharri about. This is called micro scholarship, right? When you literally write about like the high street down the road. The neighborhood is disintegrated even further since this point, but I was interested in looking at how digital community making happens in the I Love Melville Facebook group and how people use this group to do these two different things that white South Africans do. Firstly, to go, Black people who are poor, particularly Black men, are a threat and need to be expunged from our community. So there are all these posts where people are panicking about homeless people and vagrants and people pissing on the sidewalk and people doing window washing and car guards. If you've ever been to Johannesburg, you'll be familiar with these ubiquitous car guards that help you park your car in exchange for coins. All these posts on this site going, these people are criminals, these people are dangerous, they're lookouts for car thieves, da 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 da. But then also a secondary trend in this same group of people pushing back very dramatically and vocally against what seemed to be excessive racism. So when the posts about the car guards start going on about them being Black, suddenly there'll be 5 people going, no, you can't say that. No, that's not cool, bro. No, you've got to wind it back. And there'll also be a lot of posts of people going, we're collecting shoes for poor children at the local school, or like my domestic worker is going back to her home. Has anyone got any food that she can take? So there are these dual performances of whiteness. On the one hand, there's the fact that we as a community need to come together and be safe because everyone who is not like us threatens us. And on the other hand, and this is quite particular to this neighborhood, it's not that common in South Africa. On the other hand, there's the sense that we as a community need to come together and show that we are good whites and that we are liberal. And therefore that we need to do nice things for Black people. They're always, the people that get the nice things are always women and children. So men are demonized, women and children are the objects of this kind of benevolent paternalism. And within that, white members of the community get to construct an identity that makes them feel like they have some agency in their own safety, but also that they are in some way contributing to this idealized project of a non-racial South Africa. I think I will stop there because that is 21 minutes.
That was like very beautifully synchronized. Thank you, Nikki. So much to think with. And Sharri will be thinking as she responds to the book. Sharri Plonski is a reader in international politics at Queen Mary. Her work, which is concerned with settler colonial relations, anti-colonial struggles, border dynamics, and material infrastructures, is primarily anchored in the case of Palestine, Israel, and its regional and global relations. Her first book, published in 2018, is entitled Palestinian Citizens of Israel: Power, Resistance, and the Struggle for Space. And she is currently working on a project that investigates the colonial and capitalist entanglements of Israel's trade and transit infrastructures, and the materials that undergird Israel's normalization project. She has also published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and, as we said, the co-host of Material Crimes podcast. So I will hand it over to you, Sharri, for some comments.
So I'm also going to do the timing thing.
Okay.
But I actually wrote my stuff straight out. I'm not as good a storyteller, but but actually, like, it was such a joy. I told Nikki this when I went, this is going to take up my time now at the conference. But I told Nikki when I first saw it, like, what was wonderful about reading this book, and I got to read the whole thing, is like, she's an incredible storyteller, and the way that she talks is also the way that she writes, and there's just like constant winding of stories inside stories inside stories that, and in that gorgeous voice of yours too, which is like now the plug again for the podcast, because like that's part of what makes that episode so wonderful to listen to, because of the way that Nikki tells stories. But what's amazing now that I read the book, as opposed to just knowing how good you are at telling stories, is that it also becomes like a methodology for you and a mode of practice, and a way of like constantly trying to make sense of things, which also then means that she's also grounding her analysis in this like gorgeous text because it's just so fun to read. And I kind of want to get into this idea of folding a story within a story as methodology. And for me, this whole thing about making sense as you narrate and suture together these different stories that she's telling you about, that also become these kind of distinct nodes that she has to pull together to help us make sense of South Africa's very uneven, complex, and constantly, and I love that she constantly does this constantly wonderful and complex landscape. It is never just one thing. And all of it is kind of brought together, and that complexity in a way tells me a lot about how to think with and feel. And I think this point about affect is really important, that you don't just talk about these things, you're feeling the anxiety and threat and fear in the story making. And that is actually how you kind of make sense of this idea of moral panic within that space. And I know that you said that that's not what you wanted to really kind of pull out of this, but I can't help it. I actually got quite obsessed with the way you talk about moral panic and anxiety in this particular way. Which like in her stories, she's kind of like, and her mode of storytelling and sense making is really kind of trying to get us to understand that these are stories we tell about ourselves in the world that we live in. And in the world she's describing of like kind of replete with inequality and the kind of vulnerability that kind of inequality always produces at the same time. And that it's also always not just something you feel in an instant by yourself, but something that is quite social and structured by genealogies of race and class and gender. And in some ways, that's something we experience everywhere, but there's also something very specific to what she's describing about South Africa, in large part because of the specific ghosts of apartheid. And it's hidden and not so hidden monsters everywhere. And the word monster is going to come up a lot in the way that I'm going to talk about the book. So I first wanted to get into that thing that Nicky's doing about moral panics, where she makes, and she made me think about it in very different terms, the way I normally think about it as a social scientist, although I'm also obsessed with storytelling and effect and not going in a straight line in anything I say either. So I really resonate with that way of kind of constantly going into deeper and deeper layers. But what she does is this thing where she's talking about folk tales and monsters and spectacles outside the ordinary. Something that exists, but also something that exists and doesn't exist out of place. And I really hadn't thought about it that way before. This idea that moral panic, and I know that moral panics don't just emerge, and they're often, and while they're often manipulated to justify particular policies or ideologies, that they're in effect coming out of a kind of common sense convergence of these kind of multiple mediated practices that shape how people see the world, through media, law, education, culture, and how that's all entwined with these different structures and relations of power and the particular histories that underwrite them. And we know as well, when we read a lot of this literature, that it turns certain groups into threat and danger as sources of anxiety. But there's a particular way that you talk about this kind of boogeyman. And you kind of call it, the Christian nightmares, the Satanists, the occult, these magical gangs that find plasma TVs and pull out powder. And the way that you also articulate this as a way to siphon attention away from kind of the ordinary monsters that shape our world, and making that violence always appear individual and distinct and uncoupled from history, and you use the word uncanny a lot. As a way to like not put our fingers on what's really happening. And I'm now going to quote her. I'm going to do a few quotes from her because like every time I kind of read a paragraph, I had like kind of big highlights. So she says, where violence is experienced as spectacle, perhaps because of its unusually extreme nature, or because it is related to a particular political modality, or because of its heavily mediatized appearance, it can be a means of deferring realities of risk or trauma, or even the painful meaninglessness of such acts. Spectacle can be difficult, particularly in the way in which it intersects with collective social anxieties. Groups or societies sometimes turn to spectacle in order to deny or disavow the more unsettling risk of commonplace violence. And then she goes on, the spectacularity of white male violence, like the spectacularity of Satanist murders, is presented as unnatural and uncommon rather than structural and social. And that's particularly related to the chapter she was just telling about gender-based violence. And to me, I think you're saying, and I'd really love to hear more about this from you, like both that this enables and ensures that violence is only seen as violence when it's monstrous, and that violence is normal in some places and unnatural for others. And I love that you gave me this other language to think about that with. And I know that this is a wonderful book about, South Africa and its complexities, and it's for South Africans to think about themselves, but also, and that you're it's not about giving a moral story to someone else, but at the same time, of course, we always read things from the places that we read from and the work that we're doing in other sites. And so I'm particularly interested in the white supremacists and settler anxieties that are anchored in the Israeli state, and also other settler colonial states and the imperial powers that make and sustain them. And so I kept going back over and over again to each of the stories that you're telling as a way to read the Israeli state, and to read settler anxiety in the Israeli state, and to read the danger, like the way that threat operates through kind of Israel's own sense-making and storytelling, and the way that's also entangled with like kind of global notions of moral panic that ends up kind of using Israel as its kind of expression of a kind of global moral panic, and so I'm already running out of time, and I really wanted to come back to this point also in chapter 5 that kind of starts to work to connect the way white people's sense of self are operating, like in this kind of paradoxical paranoia that's always produced in the fragility of the settler space, because there's always this sense of fear tied to the stories they tell themselves about belonging and legitimacy as authentic owners of space and land, and yet always needing to fear others that land is going to be taken away from them. And to me, that's very much something you see in the way that Israel tells stories about itself and its relationship to Palestine. But then now I'll say something maybe that's even more familiar to people in this room. It's also the new and old language of like white supremacy in this country, and the Nigel Farage's and Tony Robinson's, but it's also the Keir Starmer kind of, and his implication of Enoch Powell with his Island of Strangers speech. And that kind of also brought these other two questions to mind. I'm going to try to say them really quickly, or questions/comments, which is like in that chapter that you're speaking about with the myths of white genocide, you're articulating the kind of problem of white poverty as also something uncanny, as impossible and unfathomable in the way that kind of whiteness is viewed through like kind of colonial lenses, that whiteness is supposed to bring privilege, and poor white people just don't make sense within this kind of colonial racial gaze. And so that needs to be fixed and needs protecting, because it's only possible if somebody's doing it on purpose. And I was wondering now, as you reread the book, like how much you're reading the rhetoric that we're seeing everywhere in the world, but especially UK, US right now, and regarding poor white left behind communities, and who are allegedly these victims of like, affirmative action and equality acts, and how they're losing everything to migrants coming from afar. And I was also thinking about the fact that as I read that in your work, that even if it sounds ridiculous, it's actually really needs to be taken seriously, because it's really dangerous. Because we see it in the streets when right-wing groups are marching into like all of our neighborhoods and attacking asylum hotels, but also that it's the same panic that is produced through the hostile, and like the same work that's being done through the hostile environment, which is much less visible and bureaucratic, and how those institutions are actually just as key to keep our eye on, because that's the real kind of dangerous work, the insidious work underneath. And that brings me to this final thought, which is that your work also gave me this new way to think about the genocide in Gaza in October 7th. And to kind of try to think through that lens of moral panic, and a way of kind of making Palestine and Palestinians into like monstrous actors. On one hand, we know as a way to enact genocide, but also kind of like, and this is what I was saying before, that it kind of triggered these specters and ghosts everywhere, and brought to the surface kind of centuries of like the racial work that makes Indigenous brown and Black bodies always seem threatening to that fragility of settler and imperial authenticity. And it sees them, it makes them into non-humans capable of like kind of grotesque, unhuman things, and thus always like killable. But also that it's like a way of shielding us from that kind of unspectacular everydayness that made that violence also possible, that those structures had to exist for like the kind of genocide since October 7th to happen. But also we know that's not a new day, and it's kind of a way of disconnecting the context. And so because we haven't talked about this, I wanted like, and we haven't met in person to talk about it. like, that's also something I really wanted to ask your thoughts about, how that might kind of, is this just also me just reading constantly into someone else's work? But
No,
curious.
I think I think I agree with you, really.
All right, thank you so much, Lori.
Sure.
So hand it over, to you, Nikki, for a little
Okay, can I
bit,
stand a bit?
maybe
Great.
3-4 minutes.
Okay.
max.
Try and keep it short. Okay, thank you, Sharri. It's always amazing when people actually read your work and read it quite deeply and see things in it that you didn't see in it. It's really one of the biggest privileges of academia. Okay, so a couple of things. I really like the idea of storytelling as a methodology. Partly because I'm always getting, can I swear? I'm always getting shit about my methodologies. Right? I'm always getting people going, no, it's not methodologically sound, because there are these kind of strict disciplinary performances that we're expected to do in order for our work to be considered legitimate. And I mean, those of you who are students are probably grappling with this constantly. You know, how do I make my work seem academic enough? So, you know, putting this in terms that make sense, I think, is very, very useful. A couple of things. Okay, so firstly, okay, the idea that violence is only seen as violence when it's monstrous. I think this is hugely, hugely important. In the work that I did for my PhD that then became my first book, part of it was about Satanism, and another part of it was about this so-called epidemic of white family murder that happened among white, particularly Afrikaans families towards the end of apartheid. And one of the things that came up there was the notion of black on black violence. So this phrase was used all the time towards the end of apartheid. Oh, it's just black on black violence. Oh, the more people, like 100 people have died in a township. It's just black on black violence. As though blackness and violence are so comfortably coded together that we don't need to think about it any more carefully, because it's just violence. It's not spectacular. Some more people died. No one cares. But when a white man killed his children and then himself, the spectacularity of that violence allowed everyone to go, he's an outlier. He was mentally ill. We must consider very carefully what brought him to this point. No one was ever capable of going, it's white on white violence, which would have suggested there's something rotten within white masculinity that leads us to this point. But at the same time, everyone was very comfortable going, black masculinity is inherently violent, so we can just ignore that. So I think that is a really important point, that the exceptionalization, and this, you know, we can see this in the way that the kind of narrative of the lone wolf white killer. And we know that now, we know these people are not lone wolves because they have collectives of people on 4chan who are backing up the ideas that they've got. And that's why they're writing manifestos, because they want to communicate. They're not just doing it on their own. But nonetheless, the idea of the monstrousness, the idea, you know, I use Hannah Arendt in that chapter to talk about the banality of evil, which obviously is an idea that's been almost done to death, but I think is still very useful because it helps us to go, well, you know, this person is not a monster. It's your uncle or your brother. And whether we're talking about a killer who goes and mows down a lot of people with an AK-47, or we're talking about a school teacher who rapes a load of his students in rural South Africa. Either way, it's much easier to go, this person is a monster, and thus defer the discomforting knowledge that violence is actually within us and within our societies. And then really briefly, I don't think it's overreading at all to start a conversation about Israeli settler colonialism. I think that they go together very nicely. You know, one of the things that excises Zionists in South Africa, and I say this because I know a lot of them and I'm related to a lot of them, so I hear this a lot, is the idea that you can't compare Israel to South Africa and that the apartheid comparison is not legitimate. But South Africa and Israel are actually very good places to put into conversation. I mean, I'm actually trying to work up to writing a paper about why white South African Jews, as a particular diaspora group, are so attached to Zionism and even now are incapable of thinking beyond it. There's something about the whiteness of white Jews that is very, very important. And we don't talk about Jews in those terms. But Israel is a project of white supremacy. And that means that it exhibits many of the same qualities of white supremacy. You know, yeah, okay, so two last points. Firstly, thinking about what Israel might mean in the global imaginary, a lot of the way in which October the 7th was discussed brought in suggestions of the occult. right? Suggestions of cannibalism, not directly, but babies being murdered and astonishing acts of violence and bloodiness. These things, these ideas go back to satanic panics in the 1980s. They go back to communist panics in the 1960s. They go back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion in the 1800s. Jews have whitened themselves to such an extent that they can now use the conspiracy narratives that were used against Jews and re-reflect them on the new subaltern, because these stories are so persistent. And then finally, I got to listen to Achille Mbembe the other day. Actually, I make it sound like it's so special. He works in my institution. I see him. But he was talking, he gave a really wonderful lecture at a conference, and he was talking about how the current conditions of the global economy mean that the conditions of Blackness are being forced onto everybody. So even people who, in David Rodriguez's terms, used to benefit from the wages of whiteness are starting to not benefit from the wages of whiteness, are being forced into the position of Black people or people of color, where they are more precarious and they are poorer and life is more difficult for them. This was not supposed to be a thing that happened to white people. White poverty, as you say, was meant to be uncanny. And at the same time, you have Trump stopping the food stamp program, which is basically a way of creating mass hunger and mass poverty. What the purpose is, I don't know, but I would imagine it's got something to do with ensuring a docile population. So you have this, we're at this historical moment where potentially the social power of whiteness for people who are phenotypically coded as white is starting to slip. But the metaphorical power of whiteness remains as unshakable as ever. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's hyper visible in the context of both Israel and South Africa. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nikki. And this gives us a nice chunk of time to have open it up to our audience. So questions, please, comments, thoughts.
No one want to talk about occult baby killers?
I want to ask a question. It's very kind of, because I'm writing about the CBD in Johannesburg.
Oh, cool.
I was quite fascinated about this kind of the myth of this place that was amazing, has always been amazing until the transition, and then it became extremely dangerous, and now it's like this no-go zone allegedly. So I wonder if you have anything to talk about in terms of like the different regions of Johannesburg, also very interested on kind of the wealthier areas as well and how they are portrayed. Yeah.
Other questions?
I'm
Yes.
interested in what you said about the metaphorical whiteness, the power of the white metaphor. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. To confess that I made it through the introduction and the first half of chapter 1. I was so, excited to read the rest, but I just didn't get time. So I will be doing that. So just to apologize if what I'm asking
Happens to all of us all the
I know,
time.
Yeah. We had another wonderful event earlier in the week, so I just finished that. Anyway, so I had a couple of questions. So one thing that really sort of resonated for me was the way you were dealing with the question of modernity and sort of stressing a point that I think has been made before, that rather than seeing a place like South Africa, like many other places in the global South, as constantly sort of catching up, instead, if I've understood you correctly, demonstrating some of the extremities of what either late capitalism or modernity has to offer, so affectively and obviously emotionally as well. So I guess that sort of it links to I think the point that Sharri was making as well. In South Africa, we also imagine it's not just that sort of late capitalism and some of the extremities of modernity, but we see a futurity in terms of how we've been thinking about Palestine, right? I mean, there's obviously people who sort of reject that, as you've talked about right now, but for many people, the possibility of the end of apartheid is the one thing that is keeping people going when we see the extremities of violence that we're seeing genocide in Gaza today. So I would just be really interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about this sort of question of modernity, futurity, and is there something sort of to be optimistic about, or if that, you know, quite, you know, when we hear sort of more contemporary scholars about that, or is that not the case, right? So, you know, at the end of the part of it, then you talk about the post-1994 neoliberalization of the ANC and so on. So if you could address that. And then the second question is about how useful methodologically something like psychoanalysis has been for your work. I'm relatively new to sort of affect theory, and so I would just be, and yet it seems so pertinent for thinking about the political present, you know, in the UK, the sort of the inadequacy of empirical knowledge, right? Again, I'm just thinking about what's happening in Sudan and in Palestine. It doesn't matter that we know that this many people have died. It doesn't matter that we know that, you know, our governments are sort of arming and funding what's happening. It doesn't actually effectively resonate with the vast majority of people. And so that's something that, you know, either psychoanalytically or affectively needs to be taken much more seriously, I think, by social scientists and maybe more mainstream historians. So as you can see, it's a question, but also, you know, some comments as well.
Other questions? Okay, I'll use the chair's prerogative to jump in. Amazing book, thank you. I mean, I didn't get to read the whole thing, but what I did read was fascinating. And I can't wait to finish it. I just first off to say that like I'm so happy that you both brought up the idea of storytelling as or narrative as method. Actually, I had just given a lecture kind of that where I was supposed to kind of map out my work, and I realized that like narrative becomes really important in shaping how I organize not just method but almost epistemology in a way. And so, you know, fully understand also like this question around discipline coming from a discipline like political science, where I always feel like you need to justify the fact, and I love it when colleagues come up and say, you know, I think I got something out of this, you know, your stories are lovely. But there might actually even be something like me right now, I'm like, oh my.
Very,
You know, that's really, these stories are, you know, are what we live. And if we're not gonna start from this grounded kind of approach, then what are we saying when we say theory, right? So it's just you know, nod to all of that. And from there I actually do have a kind of a bit of a methodological question. You know, you're probably one of the people who has thought the most about conspiracy theories and the kind of but also the realm of the occult and enchantment, which I find fascinating, and it's very superficially dabbled in it. When I encountered like a number of, let's call them conspiracy theories or rumors, when I was doing my ethnography in Istanbul and Cairo, and when I present that work, you know, I've gotten a few questions that have really left me like wondering, what do we do with this, right? So I've gotten a few questions like, okay, so you're talking about these, but so when you talk to interlocutors, generally you present what they're saying as their beliefs. But then when you present particular things as conspiracy theories or as rumors, there's sort of a questioning of where fact sits, and whether you're taking them seriously or not. And the ethics of that, right? Their speech acts look different from other speech acts that I present in my book specifically. And it really like stopped me in my tracks. And I, you know, I kept thinking, well, but is there something to saying that they're also not just, I mean, and that's, anyway, to saying that they are naming them rumors or naming them conspiracy theories, as opposed to other ways in which I present what my interlocutors say. I say this to you because I found, you know, the chapter on the plasma gang fascinating because you kind of present that, but you're also like grounded so nicely in what's at stake in particular readings of rumors and so on. And I was curious sort of how you think about, if this is even a question, how to like think about this maybe quantum. I'm gonna stop there even though I have a million questions, but I guess I just want to like enter.
Okay.
Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? Okay, let's give you, oh, zombie, yes.
Just I guess just a more of a question or an invitation to ask you to speak a little bit more about the bit on the online groups. So I found that very interesting, and I know that chapter wasn't in the readings. But I'm quite interested about what the specific dynamics of how that conversation was taking place in like what I presume was kind of akin to like a neighborhood, I don't want to say neighborhood watch group, but I guess something like that perhaps. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that because that's very interesting to study in these businesses.
Okay.
Can I tack on one small question to that kind of brings it? I had this thought as I was reading that chapter of what kind of permission you had to record those conversations and if people knew or at which point they knew. And I'm asking specifically because I do know someone that's now going through an ethics review where they're being like really like I think the word policed is a good one here for anything they might use from social media. And like, and so I am curious, yeah, what were some of the ethical questions about it? And because also probably you knew some of them or, you know, yeah, I was just curious how that comes out.
Yes.
Just on that point as well, did that kind of shift your, having done that research being all over the community, did that shift your like experience, the way you interact with your neighbours? Like, yeah.
I think amazing. I mean, I think that's a good bunch.
Okay.
And by the way, since there's so many, you don't have to answer all of them.
Okay.
Like a
I'll try. Okay, well, let me start with the Joburg CBD. What a great project. I mean, also terrible right now. The Joburg CBD is so interesting. When I first moved back to Johannesburg, which was 2011, I used to hang out in the center of town all the time. And it had a reputation for being dangerous and shady, but it was also a place that was fun and creative. And if you were a little bit braver and a little bit more adventurous, that's where the real Joburg lived. Now it's generally spoken of as a dangerous no-go zone. There are some areas that are now being you can't say gentrified when you talk about inner city Joburg, but are kind of being reclaimed. And there are a few big artist studios that have come up. The thing about the Joburg CBD is it's just a really powerful example of how rumor and reputation shape space. Because basically what happened was, you know, the center of Johannesburg was very, very, very vibrant, very lively, very commercial. There was also the nearby suburbs were residential and they were very white. There was one particular neighborhood that was very white and very gay and also had this reputation for being very liberal. It's where all the queer boys used to live. And now it's, I think there are something like 8 times the number of people living there that it was built for. So it's infrastructurally just like disastrous, very dangerous. Most of the people who live in Hillbrow are immigrants from elsewhere in Africa. It's full of beautiful old Art Deco apartments and is in effect a slum that's been abandoned by the state. Basically what happened to the Joburg CBD is white panic and white flight.
CBD.
So sorry, Central Business District. I forget this is not a common downtown, city center. So white people started freaking out because the law was changing and the legislation about who could live where was changing. White businesses, more importantly than residential people, started to panic. And a lot of the very wealthy businesses, the banks in particular, that were located downtown, packed up and moved to Sandton in the north of the city, which is now known as the richest square mile in Africa. There's a mall there that's like where the Vuitton store is, you know, where people were queuing during COVID because they'd made so much money on illicit face masks contracts, which should be very familiar, actually, to all of you. So what happened was businesses and secondarily people who lived in those neighborhoods started panicking because of the change. They then up and fled. That then changed the composition. So there were a lot more people and a lot poorer people. A lot of buildings were abandoned. And the police basically stopped policing it very effectively. So there was a sense that the center of Johannesburg is a dangerous, frightening no-go area. 30 years later, the center of Johannesburg is a dangerous, frightening no-go area. It's a direct consequence of white people's fear of social change. And concurrently, the fact that the ANC state is not that concerned about the urban poor and is very concerned about the urban rich. So loads of resources have been poured into the north of the city, and there are almost no resources in the city center. The question about metaphorical whiteness and the power of metaphorical whiteness. So what I mean when I say this is I'm talking again, I guess, about the work of people like David Rodinger, who talk about how simply being white confers a degree of privilege upon people. And this is why there has been so little cross-cutting class solidarity in places that are defined by racial disparity, like Brazil, the US, and South Africa. Why have the working classes in these sorts of countries not banded together to deal with the vast inequality that they face? Because the whiteness of white people has always been presented to white people so effectively as a little bit of extra privilege that it's made cross-class solidarity very, very difficult, because white people have massively invested in this. But also, when I talk about the metaphorical power of whiteness, I'm also talking about the fact that I drive around my city, because, you know, it's a driving city, in a really crappy old car. I have a 1994 Toyota Corolla, which is a very popular car in Joburg. Yes, I still have it. Because it's reliable and they don't break down very much. But these are cars that working class people drive, and working class people are largely Black. White people drive more expensive cars. There are a lot of roadblocks around Joburg, because even though our policing is like chaotic and often non-existent, someone somewhere has decided that roadblocks and checking people's license discs are important. And pretty much every time I see a roadblock, I get waved over by the cops. And 90% of those times, I'll come closer and they'll see my face and wave me on and not even ask me to stop. In the 10% of times that I do get stopped, the policemen, who are always Black, will be very friendly and call me Ma, and, you know, we'll have a little chat and then they'll wave me on. And when that's happened and I haven't had my driver's license with me, which is a finable offense, I've still been waved on. Right? This is not that these people don't know what my class position is. They don't know that, you know, I'm a professor at a university and could probably afford a better car if I could be asked. They don't know that what they are literally seeing is that, you know, I have the trappings of working classness that should make me a little bit precarious and possibly someone who merits closer policing. But they see my whiteness and automatically I am excluded from the category of people who potentially deserve punishment. Both of these things, all of these things are true. And I think, you know, part of what Achille Mbembe was talking about is that that is starting to shift. We are seeing ways, particularly in the US, I mean, in South Africa as well, there's been an explosion of not just white poverty, because we've had white poverty for a really long time, it's very old, but white people begging at traffic lights in the same way that Black South Africans have been doing for a really long time. The neighborhood where I live, you know, it's like 50-50 now. Who's going to stand at the light and ask you for money? So white poverty is becoming much more visible. But there's still this kind of strange response that a lot of people have, where they see white people who are poor and they go, a lot of Black South Africans are very vocal about the fact that they always give money to white beggars because it makes them uncomfortable. You know, that white people are not supposed to be like this. So when we talk about the enormous power of metaphorical whiteness, these are the kinds of social effects that we're talking about. The question of modernity is a really important one. And yes, you know, I talk about modernity a lot because I'm kind of personally and ideologically invested in countering this idea that the entire African continent is this like atavistic hellhole throwback, right? It's as you said, who asked that question? It's a place where people are constantly running to catch up and nothing is ever ahead of anything. And that's clearly not true. You know, one of the arguments that I make a lot is that the reason that Joburg is interesting is that things that happen all over the place are just particularly visible there. So my boyfriend is a journalist, and we have this problem of so-called what we call load shedding, right? Where the national power grid is completely overwhelmed and we have rolling blackouts and they're planned and there's an app. Some cute little guy has invented an app and now, and everyone knows what they're going to do and you've got your candles and you're this, or if you are middle class, you've got your solar, there's ways around it. And, there are plans and you make plans. Everyone in South Africa understands load shedding. So there was a point here where you guys, the UK was facing power cuts. And my boyfriend was approached by the newspaper that he works for, going, can you write us an article from a South African perspective telling British people how to deal with load shedding? So he actually sold quite a lot of stuff suddenly at that moment. People going, oh, you know. And, it's a funny example, but I think it's also a very powerful one that when terrible things or scary things happen elsewhere in the world, often people go, oh, wait, that's happened there already. Okay, how do we deal with it? And they go and look at places like Joburg or Sao Paulo or Delhi or whatever, your particular, or Cairo, whatever place your particular interest is in. But without ever going, that means that this place is actually very, very modern. There's still this idea that, that place is a disaster and a mess, but we learn how to deal with disaster and mess from them. And I genuinely feel as though I'm not the only person who says this. Abdul Malik Simone says this a lot, right? That the global South city, the kind of paradigmatic global South city, is not behind. It is a blueprint for what is going to happen everywhere. The increasing wealth disparity in large cities that have globalized, the way that people, this is a very London thing, right? That people who do the labor live further and further away from the center and have to spend more and more and more time traveling in order to make the lives of people who live in the center feel as seamless as possible. This has been going on in Johannesburg since the 70s, right? We know what this looks like. And there are also other examples we could talk about. We could talk about the kind of crazy explosion of digital technology in Nigeria, where, the global north, the big tech companies don't really understand Nigeria, so they don't really make that much effort. You've got your Netflix and whatever, but there are indigenous forms of technology that are popping up that use people's phones that are wild and really, really, really creative and very forward thinking, very highly advanced. But you asked about optimism, and I actually don't think optimism is relevant, right? It's not even about going, can we look at a city like Johannesburg and go, okay, things will be better. It's more about going, what does actually exist there that's not just terrible? And Joburg, if you spend any time there, you start to realize that in amongst the potholes and the load shedding, it's a wildly creative city. The kind of the world of visual arts, the world of music, the world of fashion, like queer fashion in Joburg is just completely, completely insane. That it's less about optimism or pessimism and more about going really, really, really terrible things and really, really, really exciting things coexist so closely in a city like that, as opposed to cities in the north where they are kind of a little bit further apart or a little bit more co-opted. So I think that's the thing that can make a place like Joburg so interesting as a blueprint for the modern. Psychoanalysis. Okay, so I talk about affect a lot, but I don't actually use affect theory because, if I can be honest, I find it kind of impenetrable. I know that this work is important and I know it's really good, but as I have gotten older in my scholarly career, I've developed more of a resistance to work that I find difficult to read. Which doesn't mean it's not good or important work. I just, I want to be able to read something and understand it. So I don't engage that much with affect theory, although I do obviously use Sara Ahmed because everyone has to use Sara Ahmed if they're going to talk about emotions as even vaguely political. But psychoanalysis is absolutely foundational to so much of the stuff I do. And that is because of my PhD, because my PhD was at Birkbeck or through Birkbeck, and I was in a psychoanalysis reading group that was led by Jacqueline Rose. And Jacqueline Rose had a huge impact on the way that I thought about psychoanalysis. And I don't, as an analytical field or theory, I think it's massively flawed, but as a way of understanding social phenomena, it's really useful. The idea of something being overdetermined, the idea of something being repressed. These are notions that I come back to over and over and over again. And I wouldn't necessarily say that, psychoanalysis is a useful tool for helping us understand how the world works. I don't know, you could maybe argue that. What I think it is it's an incredibly fruitful vocabulary. It gives us a set of terms. It gives us access to a kind of language that helps to explain and understand large-scale social phenomena that I think is invaluable. I mean, there are few schools of theory that offer as rich a set of terminology, a form of vocabulary. So I think, there's, as with a lot of things, there's a tendency to want to go, ugh, throw it out. But I don't think we should. With moral panic theory as well. I'm a person who's very interested in language. I'm interested in words. And I guess this goes with the whole storytelling thing. What do things sound like? How do we explain that something is evocative and meaningful? So I think that the language that we use is very important. And I think the language of psychoanalysis is so deeply embedded in Western, which I must include myself in because I'm an English language, so I'm a white English first language speaker. I think it's so embedded in our ways of thinking in the 21st century that to ignore that would be detrimental. Okay, what are we talking about? Okay, so the idea of storytelling. And narrative as method, and the question of ethics, and how we firstly acknowledge that something is a rumor or conspiracy, but secondly acknowledge that it has meaning and importance and value for individual people. This is so tricky. So in the chapter about the Satanist murders, I had a terrible experience with the first people who, I'm not going to tell you who they were, fancy publishers who were going to publish this book, who wanted me to completely rewrite it into something else. But the one good thing that came out of that was that their first peer reviewer read that chapter and said, you sound like a highly educated, middle-class, white academic in a city going, look at these stupid people. Because I was going on about how talking about these murders as satanic was like flawed and damaging and not correct. And, the argument that I was trying to make is that it was helping us to look away from the problem of GBV and monsterize and sensationalize. But what that reader heard was an academic 5 steps removed from this being snobby and judgmental. So I had to dial that whole chapter right back and rethink about it and try and find a line between acknowledging that these kinds of stories may have very, very powerful negative social effects, but also acknowledging that they may be important for people for specific reasons. And that none of us have the right to undermine other people's faith or religious beliefs. One thing that, when we talk about this particular question, one thing that I keep coming back to is a scholar called Louise White. I'm talking about the vampires in East Africa. So, it's such a stunning book that I read years ago, and it really resonated with me. She talks about how all these rumors of vampires in colonial East Africa, how people are basically going, white doctors are vampires, they're going to come and get me and steal my blood. And the auto response for most people is to go, how ridiculous, how silly. And what she does is she shows that, no, that's not ridiculous or silly. It's completely true. It's just phrased in metaphor. Because the white colonial state was sucking people's blood. It was cannibalizing them. It was sucking them dry and leaving them with nothing. Maybe not through the practice of vampirism, but within people's own understandings of the world, within the cosmologies that they already had, that was the most useful way to explain something that was already happening. So rather than simply going, people are stupid because they're imposing occult understandings onto things, what Louise White teaches us is that we need to understand what metaphor actually does. So again, we're back to language and storytelling. So I think it's a really important question. And I think it's a particularly important question for people who do media work or textual work rather than ethnography. It's a lot easier to remind yourself to respect other people's positions when you talk to them as humans. When you're reading about them second or third hand, it's far too easy to just dismiss them outright as superstitious fools. So, that's a caveat for those of us who work in the kind of area that I work in. Okay, the question of online groups, the specific dynamics of I Love Melville. This is now completely irrelevant because it's been superseded by WhatsApp, which is a very, very different thing. The Facebook group now is all pictures of lost dogs. But it used to be a place where people very intensely tried to build community, and they'd go, hey, Melville, let's do this. Let's get together and clean this. Let's do this. Let's support this person. Da, da, da. There was all this kind of very, very overt, very enthusiastic building of a collective identity. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting about that chapter, so right at the end, I think it's at the end of the chapter, I talk about a specific post that was put on that group during the time period I'm interested in, that was mostly the posters seem to be white. You can never really tell on Facebook, but the avatars and the names and the way that they speak suggest a sort of whiteness. Then right at the end, there's this post put on by a Black woman who's looking for a place to live. And it's so interesting the way that she phrases this, that she is incredibly, she's code switching into the vernacular of the I Love Melville Facebook group by being cute and friendly and funny and jokey and self-deprecating. And she's doing all this stuff that people in the group relate to and find legible and understandable. And when most people who post on that group, when most Black people posted on that group, they were just ignored. People going, I need a job or I need a place to live, just no responses. This woman had like huge number of responses of people going, we love you. You're exactly the sort of person we want in our community. I wish I had somewhere for you to live. I wish you the best of luck. When you move to Melville, let us know. We'll go for a drink. So there's this whole thing of you can access this digital community if you can speak to people in a language that they're comfortable with. And as soon as they're not comfortable with it, you are ignored or shouted down. The question of the ethics of that chapter, tricky. It was at the time that I collected the data that I wrote on, it was a public group. It's since become a private group. So now I couldn't do it. So I didn't get permission from anyone. I obviously anonymized it really dramatically. I anonymized all that. There's like, but you could still, if you wanted to put one of those posts into a search engine, back then at least, you could probably have found the name of the person who posted it. This was written a little while ago, so I got away with it. But now, I mean, I teach in media studies. The ethics board at my university is insane. We're actually, the whole faculty of humanities is trying to push back on how intense the ethics process is, on the assumption that, if you are posting things publicly, how much permission do scholars need to talk about what you're posting? So when I have students now who work on things on X or Facebook, what I tend to tell them, firstly, it needs to be publicly available. It can't be a closed group, which is why you can't write on WhatsApp, which kills me because the WhatsApp moms groups are like a treasure trove.
Yes.
You have to paraphrase. So you have to anonymize and paraphrase so that nothing is searchable. You can write about Reddit with no fear because everyone is anonymous. And I mean, I do think, the Association of Internet Researchers is really good on this. They have really good guidelines that are very common sense based. And they're like, you do it in a way that it does no harm. If the person has a public profile already, if they are an influencer, if they have a lot of followers, you can write about them freely. If they are an anonymous person who has some expectation of anonymity, then it's important that you go as far as possible to make sure that the comment or whatever you're quoting is not associated with their real identity. But university ethics boards don't understand this, and they are putting, policing is the word you use, they are putting barriers in place that mean that scholars and students are actually becoming incapable of looking at the places where some of the most harmful social discourses are emerging, because they are so overly cautious now that they're basically saying it's more important to protect the privacy of someone who posts on X than it is to look at how right-wing violence is spread through certain online spaces. I think it's hugely problematic. Obviously, we all know this. We know ethics are important. We know it's important to look after people. But ethics and scholarship were developed to protect the vulnerable. And it feels to me like ethics boards at universities now are making more effort to protect the powerful or those in majority rather than minority positions. And I don't understand how we've come to this point, but it is very troubling. And then the final question was whether the chapter on Melville had any real world effects. I mean, my first book was based on my PhD, and it was about Satanism and family murder and whiteness. I've done a lot of work on whiteness, and there was a point when I was getting so many death threats, and I'd get people writing things to me going, how can, like, there was a whole lot of stuff about, how can people calling me Eastern European, because I'm Jewish, so that's coding, because a lot of South African Jews are Eastern European. Look at that Eastern European woman. How dare she talk about whiteness? Look at her lips. She's not even properly white. So loads of stuff like that. So there was a little bit of kind of snottiness from people in my neighborhood who knew who I was. But compared to the kind of outpouring of rage that you get as a white woman who dares to speak critically about whiteness, it was nothing. It was absolutely nothing. And also, it's an academic book. So no one reads them. Yeah.
And on that hopeful note on academia, the usefulness of our books, I cannot thank you enough, Nikki and Sharri, for an incredible conversation. Thank you so much. We've learned so much, and I'm so happy that you were able to fit us into your UK trip. So yeah, huge round of applause. And thanks to all of you for coming today, for coming to our other seminars as well. Just as a reminder, after reading week, we will come back with a talk by Tithi Bhattacharya on November 13th. Yeah, 16th.
No, sorry, I think I was gonna correct you, but I think I was gonna correct you for the wrong day.
Okay,
so-
November
It's on the
13th,
website.
5 p.m. It's on our website, the Walter Rodman Collective at SOAS.
It's on a Thursday.
It's on a Thursday. It's on a Thursday
I know
at
you've
5.
got to do it.